Welcome to this episode of Summa Made Simple, in which we shall be discussing question 149 of the second part of Summa Theologica, which covers the virtue of sobriety in 4 articles. The first one asks, what is the matter of sobriety? In that one, we shall pay special attention to the body of the article. Whether it is a special virtue or not, we shall skip altogether. Thirdly, whether the use of wine is lawful. There we shall look at the body of the article as well as one objection. And the fourth question, we shall look at it in its entirety. To whom especially is sobriety becoming? Because that one, I find it very relevant to the man on the streets now. And all those other 3 questions are kind of useful to give us a context so that we can understand that fourth question and all the objections and all of the replies to the objections, etc. The first article, whether drink is the matter of sobriety. The first objection says it would seem that drink is not the matter proper to sobriety, and the rest of the objections follow in the same line, that sobriety does not have to do with drink. St. Thomas obviously is going to tackle these objections, but first is going to give his response in general. On the contrary, it is written that wine taken with sobriety is equal life to men. If you drink it moderately, you shall be sober. So that's a quotation from scripture, underlining the idea that sobriety has to do specifically with drink. I answer that. When a virtue is named from some condition common to the virtues, the matter specially belonging to it is that which it is most difficult and most commendable to satisfy that condition of virtue. Thus, for example, fortitude is about dangers of death, and temperance about pleasures of touch. Now, sobriety takes its name from measure. For a man is said to be sober because he observes the bria, that is, the measure. So St. Thomas there is giving us an etymology of the word sobriety. I looked up the word sobriety in the online etymological dictionary, etymonline.com. They did not agree with this one, but I am tempted to lean more towards St. Thomas Aquinas' definition because I trust him more. I just trust him more than the guys who made the etymology dictionary. Whether sobriety lays a special claim to that matter, wherein the observance of the measure is most deserving of praise. Such matter is the drinking of intoxicants, because the measured use thereof is most profitable, while immoderate excess therein is most harmful, since it hinders the use of reason even more than excessive eating. Hence it is written, quoting that first quote which we gave earlier, sober drinking is health to soul and body. Wine drunk with excess raises quarrels and wrath and many ruins. For this reason, sobriety is especially concerned with drink, not any kind of drink, but that which by reason of its volatility is liable to disturb the brain, such as wine and all intoxicants. So that first article about what is the matter of sobriety explains to us what sobriety is. That sobriety is that virtue aligned under temperance that enables us, or is especially concerned with drink, but not just any kind of drink, but drink which can actually make us feel intoxicated. We're going to skip the second article and move directly to the third article, whether the use of wine is altogether unlawful. So in other words, this question is saying, given that wine is such a harmful thing, given that alcohol, an intoxicating drink, is such a harmful thing, I mean, surely we shouldn't even touch it, right? And in that respect, I want to jump to the third objection, which is the one which we shall look at. Further, Jerome says that after the deluge, after the flood, wine and flesh were sanctioned, were allowed. But Christ came in the last of the ages and brought back the end in line with the beginning. Therefore, it seems unlawful to use wine under the Christian law. I kind of alluded to this in that episode where we spoke about the vice of insensibility and how some people, some Christian sects or Christian, I don't want to use the word sects, let's say denominations. Some Christian denominations are very extreme in this regard and say if you touch alcohol in any way, shape or form, that is a sin. Alcohol is never ever to be touched. And St. Thomas is using St. Jerome as an authority to back that up. And the argument here is wine only became a thing after the flood. and eating of flesh also became a thing after the flood. But when Jesus came, he sort of brought everything back in line with the beginning. Do you remember, for instance, when he said divorce is illegal or unlawful? And then the Pharisees asked him, but why did Moses allow us then to divorce our wives? And Jesus said, that's not how it was at the beginning. And so basically this is what the argument that St. Thomas is putting forward to support the claim that wine is unlawful. Jesus came and brought things back to how they were at the beginning. And right at the beginning, before the flood, people never used to drink wine. So that's the argument. On the contrary, the apostle, that is St. Paul, says in 1 Timothy verse 23, do not still drink water, but use a little wine for your stomach's sake and your frequent infirmities. And it is written in Ecclesiastes 31 verse 36, wine drunk with moderation is the joy of the soul and the heart. So St. Thomas goes into his answer. I answer that no meat or drink considered in itself is unlawful, according to Matthew 15 verse 2. Not that which goeth into the mouth defileth a man. Wherefore it is not unlawful to drink wine as such. In other words, it's not unlawful to drink wine in and of itself. Wine in and of itself is not an evil thing. Yet it may become unlawful accidentally. In other words, the circumstances under which alcoholic beverages are drunk are what could make it a sinful thing. Let's unpack that. This is sometimes owing to a circumstance on the part of the drinker, either because he is easily the worse for taking alcohol or because he is bound by a vow not to drink alcohol. Sometimes it results from the mode of drinking because, to wit, for example, namely, he exceeds the measure in drinking. And sometimes it is on account of others who would be scandalized thereby. So in other words, St. Thomas is saying, drinking alcohol is not in and of itself, it's not intrinsically an evil or a sinful thing. What can make it evil or sinful are the circumstances around it, and he names different ones. So for instance, it could be that a person is very quickly affected by alcohol. Like, different people have different thresholds of getting drunk. Some people can get drunk very, very quickly. Such people who would get super drunk super quickly should not be touching alcohol. And if they do, for them, it could very likely be a sin because of how it affects them quickly and gets them to the stage where their reason is no longer in charge of all their different impulses. And that is the primary problem with intoxicants, that they unseat wisdom from reason. They unseat reason from being in charge. And remember, virtue safeguards the good of reason against the onslaught of the impulses such as emotions and our desires. So that's one circumstance, someone who gets very easily drunk. Or secondly, because he is bound by a vow not to drink alcohol. The only thing that comes to mind in this respect are the ones which you read about in the Bible, where someone takes the vow of the Nazarene or the vow of the Nazarite that they shall not touch any strong drink. Even their mother is not supposed to touch any strong drink. So they don't touch any strong drink from their mother's womb for the rest of their lives. Samson was an example of this. But I don't know of any modern day examples. Thirdly, sometimes it results from the mode of drinking because, namely, he exceeds the measure in drinking. So basically, and this is where most people fall into the sins against sobriety. It's not that alcohol or whiskey or wine or gins or spirits are evil in themselves. It's that the person just drinks too much. So it's not, the problem isn't the alcohol, the problem is the drinker of the alcohol. And sometimes it is on account of others who would be scandalized thereof. So if one finds oneself in a situation where people would commit a sin because they see you drinking, so maybe they themselves would perhaps drink too much, or other circumstances that I mentioned earlier would kick into play. So let's say someone is an alcoholic. You have a good friend who's an alcoholic, and they've been on the wagon now. It's been 360 days since they last drink. And you know that if you go out to this guy, to catch up and, just have some drinks, you know that if you order alcohol, it will be very hard for him not to order alcohol. But you go ahead and you order alcohol, and then that guy also orders alcohol, and you can't stop him because he's seen it now. His thirst for the alcohol has been awakened, and he just has to have a drink, and after that it's downhill from there. You it's very probable that you have committed a sin by causing someone else to sin. That's the sin of scandal. Scandal literally means something that makes someone to trip over. So when you make someone trip, when you make someone fall, that's the sin of scandal. When you make someone else commit a sin. So the third one, I wanted to pay attention to the third objection, where Jerome said, listen, I mean, before the flood, wine was not sanctioned. Wine was not a thing. Drinking alcohol was not a thing. It was only after the flood that Noah kind of discovered it. And then, but Jesus Christ brought things back in line with the beginning. The reply to that objection is, Christ withdraws us from some things as being altogether unlawful and from others as being obstacles to perfection. It is in the latter way, being obstacles to perfection, that he withdraws some from the use of wine, from the use of alcohol, that they may aim at perfection, even as from riches and from the like. So this is a concept which is worth understanding, because St. Thomas is going to bring it up a number of times. The difference between precepts and counsels. So precepts are kind of like rules. They are laws. These are hard boundaries, hard requirements that are needed for us to achieve holiness or perfection. And then you have counsels. Counsels are kind of like the optional things. Think of it as school, right? If you want to graduate from school and get your high school diploma or whatever, you have some certain compulsory subjects which you have to do. It could be English or some language and mathematics or something like that, right? You've got the basic which everyone has to do. Think of these as the precepts. And then you've got the optional stuff, advanced this and higher level that, etc., which kind of give you like a leg up if you want to get into certain specific degrees at certain specific universities. Think of these as the counsels of perfection. So what are some of these precepts of perfection? So for instance, precepts of perfection, precepts of holiness, includes stuff like when it comes to marriage, divorce. Divorce is unlawful. Like Jesus just said, divorce is not a thing. It doesn't exist in God's eyes. Divorce is unlawful. It is sinful. However, there are those who abstain from even getting married. They remain celibate for the rest of their lives for the sake of the kingdom of God, because it makes it easier for them to focus their full-time energy and attention to spreading God's word in all the different milieu of this world. Now that is the first one, like the rule against divorce, that's compulsory. That's like your math and your English in high school. And then the second one, that is like your higher grade math, higher second language, third language, whatever. That's the counsel. Not everyone has to do it, but if it's just for a few who should do it, who have received the special grace to do it, and it kind of like gives them a leg up. They can do a little bit more, a little bit quicker, a little bit better. So that's the idea here, that wine does not be wine. The not drinking of wine belongs to, or alcohol belongs to, the second group. It's like a counsel. It's like an advanced level thing. But like I said earlier, at least I haven't come across anyone in present day society who takes such a vow. Probably they exist and I've just not been exposed enough to my fellow human beings. The fourth article, whether sobriety is more requisite in persons of greater standing. This one I wanted us to tackle in its completion. So I'll go through all of the objections and read the answer to it. Objection 1, it would seem that sobriety is more requisite in persons of greater standing. For old age gives a man a certain standing, wherefore honor and reverence are due to the old, according to Leviticus chapter 19, verse 32. Rise up before the hoary head and honor the person of the aged man. Now the apostle declares that old men especially should be exhorted to sobriety, according to Titus chapter 2, verse 2, that the aged man be sober. Therefore sobriety is more requisite in persons of standing. Objection 2, further, a bishop has the highest degree in the church, and the apostle commands him to be sober, according to 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2. It behoveth, or it is proper, it is fitting to a bishop to be blameless, the husband of one wife, sober, prudent, etc. Therefore, sobriety is chiefly required in persons of high standing. Thirdly, further, sobriety denotes abstinence from wine or alcohol. Now, wine or alcohol is forbidden to kings who hold the highest place in human affairs. I guess now you'd say presidents, right? While it is allowed to those who are in a state of affliction, according to Proverbs 31, verse 4. Give not wine to kings, and further on, verse 6, give strong drink to them that are sad, and wine to them that are grieved in mind. Therefore, sobriety is a more requisite in persons of standing. On the contrary, the apostle says in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2, the women in like manner should be chaste, sober, etc. And in Titus chapter 2, verse 6, young men in like manner exhort that they be sober. What is he driving at? Is he saying that bishops and kings, etc., should be allowed strong drink, and then women and young people should not? Not exactly. And he's going to cover all of this in the reply to the objection, in the body of the article. On the contrary, I answer that virtue includes relationship to two things: to the contrary vices, which it removes, and to the end or the goal to which it leads. Accordingly, a particular virtue is more required, is more needed in certain persons for two reasons. First, because they are more prone to the concupiscences, to the drives, to the inclinations, to the leanings, which need to be restrained by virtue, and to the vices which are removed by virtue. In this respect, sobriety is more needed, is more requisite in the young and in women. So in other words, not just people of greater standing, but across the board. He's aligning it with gender and age. In this respect, sobriety is more needed in the young and in women because concupiscence of pleasure thrives in the young on account of the heat of youth, while in women there is not sufficient strength of mind to resist concupiscence. Hence, according to Valerius Maximus, among the ancient Romans, women drank no wine. Let's unpack that, because some people might find that a stumbling block, might find that a scandal, and make them say terrible things about the church and about St. Thomas Aquinas, which may or may not be a sin. So let's unpack that. Let's explain that a little bit better. I think with respect to that first thing that he says, the first idea he brings up, sobriety is more requisite in the young because concupiscence of pleasure thrives in the young on account of the heat of youth. This is something which just human experience shows clearly, that young people are more inclined to look for adventure, to have a good time, to be spontaneous, to enjoy themselves, etc. And then a lot of the training of a young person is to get them to take on responsibility, be mature, do what they're supposed to do, and realize that life is not just one big party, right? In the immortal words of a certain pop musician, life is one big party when you're still young. And that's what this point is alluding to. But then, so this is why sobriety is more requisite in the young, because sobriety is needed to help them curb those strong emotions which they feel, which push them towards having a lot of pleasure and having a good time and sex, drugs, and rock and roll, basically. Now, what about women? This is where people could get their hackles up. Are you saying women should not be allowed to drink alcohol? Why is that? That is sexist. That is so patriarchal, etc. I can hear all the objections being hurled this way already. But here's the explanation. Do you remember we said that virtue safeguards the good of reason against the onslaught of the passions? And one thing I remember so clearly is the definition of discussing patience. Virtue safeguards the good of reason against the onslaught of the passions, and the strongest of the passions is sorrow. That's what we said when we were discussing patience, right? If you remember correctly. So virtue safeguards the good of reason, which we discussed in the last episode, against the onslaught of the emotions. Now, when you look at the difference between men and women, I think one thing that becomes relatively clear is that women tend to experience emotions more intensely, more suddenly, and more deeply than men. That's why it's more typical if you're to go to a wedding, right? The person who you most likely hear screaming and shouting and in celebration, is it more likely to be men or women? If you go to a funeral, the people who you're more likely to find, sobbing their hearts out and being completely inconsolable Are they more likely to be men or women? Like, I know it's, you could say, okay, there's that exception and that exception, but generally speaking, I think it's something which most people have observed, and I can speak for myself in this, that women tend to experience and to portray and to display emotions because they experience them in that way more profoundly, more deeply, and to a greater extent than men. I think I don't know if it's, maybe it's biology, maybe it's hormones. I don't know what it is, but I think women experience emotions in a far stronger way than men. So, in that respect, they do need something which is going to protect them, even in a more special way, against the onslaught of their strong emotions. In fact, the first time I read this is when and I was thinking through this. That's when I realized, you know what? Probably this is why it's more likely to hear of a woman being seduced by a man than to hear of a man being seduced by a woman. That is why probably historically in most societies you have a lot of institutions and safeguards put in place to protect the chastity of women, because I don't know if it's this emotion thing, they feel it more strongly. It feels to me like, just looking at society now and historically, it's far easier for women to be carried away by their emotions and to do something which has lasting and permanent damage, much more than men. And hence, according to Valerius Maximus, among the ancient Romans, women drank no wine. Why? Because wine, alcohol, has this tendency to unseat reason from being in charge, from controlling the emotions. So, as a result, it makes more sense that young people and women should have a greater care for sobriety, because their emotions are particularly strong compared to, or stronger compared to, old people and to men. And then he finishes off the point. Secondly, sobriety is more requisite in certain persons as being more necessary for the operations proper to them. Now, immoderate use of alcohol is a notable obstacle to the use of reason. Wherefore, sobriety is specially prescribed to the old, in whom reason should be more vigorous in instructing others, to bishops and all ministers of the church, who should fulfill their spiritual duties with a devout mind, and to kings who should rule their subjects with wisdom. This suffices for the replies to the objections. And that is where we're going to end today's episode. And in the next episode, we shall tackle questions on the vice of drunkenness. See you next time.